we don't want to move elsewhere. We are not going to ask our children now to move to another country. The fact is, our ancestors worked hard to make sure that we as a people are formed down the southern tip of Africa. We're not going to disrespect that. We also have the interests of future generations in mind. We also have to make sure that our culture is transferred to future generations. And that cannot be done abroad. You cannot in the long term, or there's a real risk. If you go to another country now, there's a real risk that your grandchildren will not say to you in the morning, "Hello, Opa." They would say something like, "Hi, Granddad," or something in that respect. And that we don't want. That is why we are committed to find solutions locally. What are those solutions? I think there's a two-pronged approach. Flip Buys mentioned the Afrikaner Declaration. In the first place, Afrikaners want recognition as a group, not privilege. We want to be, as anybody else, recognized as first-class citizens.
Speaking over the much-debated land issue, Afriforum accused government of setting black people up for failure.
The fact is, government does not provide land for communities. They take it for themselves, and they give permission for somebody to use it, and they can kick them off. So that's nationalization of land. And so this act will not solve that. It will worsen that. The government's land reform program has failed dismally. Why? Because they don't give property rights to people that get their land. And if you don't have a title deed, you cannot go to a bank and get funding, and therefore you are set up for failure. So government has set up black people for failure on farms in this country, and to their own acknowledgement, 90% of these farms are failing. So for that, this government also needs to take responsibility. There is a land restitution program that we are in favor of, people that lost their land unfairly and was not compensated. In terms of that program, why does it fail? This government loves to blame people for other people for what's going wrong, to hide their own responsibility.
For more on this story, we're now joined by U.S. correspondent Simon Mark. Simon, a very good evening to you, but I believe it's lunchtime in the U.S. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, it's been quite an eventful week with tweets flying between South Africa and the USA, and President Trump just speaking about that Land Expropriation Act that has been signed into law by President Ramaphosa, and of course the presidency responding to what Elon Musk had also put out on Twitter. What do you believe really motivated President Trump in putting forward that executive order calling for the seizing of funds in South Africa? And how does this fit with the broader foreign policy framework in your country?
Well, look, there's no question, Ketlejo, that this has been a completely head-spinning week in the bilateral relationship between the White House and President Ramaphosa and his government. And in many ways, the South African-US bilateral relationship is now at its lowest ebb, certainly in the post-apartheid era, and arguably at its lowest ebb ever. I don't think things ever got this bad even during the apartheid era. It is evident that people have been whispering into Donald Trump's ear about the expropriation law, now on the statute books, in South Africa for the last several years. As you know, Afriforum made a trip to the United States to lobby people in Trump world about the issue. Many of those people have remained all over the detail of that issue, but appear to have communicated to President Trump not, according to the South African government, the actual facts in all of this. So if you look at some of the most recent communications by Donald Trump and by people at the top of his administration, they actually seem to be arguing that land expropriation is taking place and that it is disproportionately targeting white Afrikaner landowners, which has led Donald Trump to find himself this weekend in an absolutely extraordinary position. On the one hand, leading the largest mass deportation efforts ever to take place in the United States, with thousands of migrants being rounded up here, illegal immigrants to the United States, and being put on flights back to countries all over Latin America, to India, and to other parts of the world. But meanwhile saying that he will open America's doors to any Afrikaner farmer whose land has been expropriated and who wants to seek refugee status. And yet, as we just heard there from Afriforum, Afriforum's position is that those farmers absolutely don't want to leave South Africa, and nobody wants to come and take advantage of Donald Trump's offer. All of this comes at a time when there are additional strains, as President Trump's executive order notes, in the bilateral relationship over the ICJ activity that saw Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu branded as war criminals over events in Gaza, and Donald Trump more broadly accusing South Africa of siding with actors that are hostile to the United States, including Russia and China, with the all-important G20 summit this November in Johannesburg absolutely hanging in the balance. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announcing that he's boycotting that meeting of G20 foreign ministers in South Africa in 2 weekends' time. So how everybody finds their way back from the edge of the abyss in this bilateral relationship, I think is going to be complicated under any circumstances, and extremely complicated given the febrile nature of events politically here in Washington at the moment, with the Trump administration and Elon Musk in his position clearly now moving very rapidly on a number of different fronts, and someone having to get to the Trump administration and say, I don't honestly think you've got your facts straight.
I mean, speaking of a very difficult and complex situation, a number of tweets, like we mentioned earlier on, have been going back and forth. One very recent from the spokeswoman of the United States Department of State, and hers reads that the United States stands ready to help the descendants of settlers in South Africa who are being expropriated and abused by the South African government. Pursuant to President Trump's executive order, the State Department is suspending all non-life-saving aid to the Republic of SA. Persecuted South African farmers and other innocent victims being targeted solely based on their race who choose to resettle in America will be welcome. She continues to say that the United States will also defend the rights and interests of those remaining descendants of settlers threatened with expropriation without compensation and other intolerable abuses. We will no longer stand by while God-given rights are so cruelly violated. So for the American audience, Simon, is there a significance of the Land Expropriation Act in South Africa that it has just garnered so much attention?
Well, I think it's very important to underscore, it's a good question. I think it's very important to underscore that up until this week, and even frankly now, the vast majority of Americans have paid absolutely no attention whatsoever to the Expropriation Act. But there are people within the far right here, particularly with access to Donald Trump, that have paid attention to it. And so organizations like Breitbart News here, a far-right-leaning website, much favored by the Trump administration, even now being granted access to White House and Pentagon news briefings on a daily basis, they have relentlessly been covering details of the Expropriation Act, and there is no question that there are some South African figures here, including Elon Musk, who obviously have access to the president's ear and may well have influenced him. But look, let's be absolutely clear. You can stop 10 people on the streets, even of Washington, D.C., and ask them about the South African Expropriation Act, and you will be greeted with entirely blank stares. And let's also be clear, the United States, as the South African government has noted, has expropriation arrangements here that in many ways are more draconian than the possibilities that are permitted under South African law. There's a process here known as eminent domain, and you can travel all over the United States and find people who have suddenly discovered that their land has been confiscated, in many cases with either no compensation or only limited compensation, as a result of eminent domain being cited by the US government. It basically allows the government to say, we need that land for the purposes of building a high-speed railway or expanding a highway. Awfully sorry, you can't fight us. We're coming in and we're taking it because it's in the national interest to do that. So, you know, this notion that the United States is free from criticism over the purity of its own expropriation arrangements is a curious one. But there's more to this than just the expropriation arrangements. This is the reflection of irritation, particularly among Republicans on the right, over South Africa's muscular foreign policy, particularly as it pertains to Israel, particularly what took place at the ICJ, and a desire by President Trump, cognizant of the fact that South Africa holds the rotating presidency of the G20, perhaps to use that G20 summit as a bit of a negotiating point, as a bit of a diplomatic opportunity to try and force not only South Africa, but other countries to pick between their partnership, their relationship with Washington, D.C.,
right,
and the relationships that they enjoy with America's competitors on the world stage, particularly Russia and China.
Well, it's certainly, Simon, going to be a very complex time, like you've already explained it. I'd be very interested to know and understand what the remarks are from American citizens with regards to taking in refugees from South Africa, given the stance of President Trump earlier in the week with regards to refugees from other countries coming into that country. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Simon Marks, thank you so much for joining us this evening.